Now, it's time for another Dice Tower review with the Game Boy Geek.
A while back, I reviewed a cooperative game from Academy Games called Freedom: The Underground Railroad. It's one of my favorite cooperative games. Man, the theme is so thick, it's historic. Oh gosh, it's such a great game. It's one of my favorites. And recently, a publisher called Rosen Classroom, so Academy Games has partnered with some authors. Actually, one of the authors of this game, Brian Mayer, helped in these books. A teaching book, so teaching the Underground Railroad through play. This is a 5-week or 5-session course for high school students that will have them immerse themselves in the game, but also learn a lot of the history behind what's going on, and not just the game, but the roles and how the slaves felt, the different vocabularies and historical pieces that they'll read. It's really interesting. Let me show you how this course is laid out, how it's different from some of the other books they've done, and what I finally think. So here's a closer look at the cover, and let's get through and start looking at how this is constructed. Now, so here are the table of contents. Here are the 5 different lessons that you'd go through in a week's time, 1 lesson per day in a high school setting. And so we have the introduction about the Underground Railroad and what it is. In the first lesson, you review the board and explore the map. You'll be looking at the game board itself. The second lesson, they'll explore the roles that we're taking on by the active members of the abolition. So we'll be looking at the role cards that are in the game and what they mean and how they're significant. In lesson 3, they'll learn the mechanisms used to help the slaves get free through the Underground Railroad. Lesson 4 will explore the major laws that address slavery throughout America. And then the final lesson, we'll talk about strategies and engaging with the game as a part of instruction. So that's sort of the intro of how this is laid out. Lots of information about the cards and the people that are on them. So lesson 1 is life as a slave, right? So we talk about the historical information of losses of identity and poor life conditions, slaves bought and sold, the hunger for freedom, kidnapped, the struggle to stay free. So we have this lesson plan. There's questions, there's vocabulary of overseer, plantation, slave market, some other suggested reading materials, and then you use the game board as a focal point for introducing the game components to the students. So we'll be looking at the different things. We'll be looking at the cubes. We'll be looking at the conductor tokens. We'll be looking at the cards of the people that are there. We'll be looking at the actual slave cubes themselves, and we'll be learning each of these things together of what all these are. So it gets their feet barely wet. Lots of guided practice and reading and discussions as to what's an example of a way that which slaves were denied the chance to make choices. So lots of interesting questions here that they'll go through. In the narrative, develop a fictional conversation between 2 slaves talking about being sold on, and that's a concept that you'll learn about in the readings. And then here is the main reading, the Uncle Sam's Emancipation that they'll have. Now you can go online. There's a website that the book has at the back that the teacher will be able to print out copies of all these reading materials for them. So lesson 2 is about slavery and abolitionism. So we talk about the rise of slavery in America, the Southern arguments for slavery, the rise of abolition movements. Talk about the Quakers, the roles of the Underground Railroad. That's when we start looking at all the different roles of the people and what they were. And so we actually look at Harriet Tubman and we look at and we see what their roles were and how they act and what their actual roles do in the game and how that fits thematically with what was going on in the actual time period. So we go through all those different people and what roles they play in the game. Turning points in the movement. So then obviously you have the essential questions, you have different vocabularies, and these are a lot of the roles that we had talked about, and some other suggested reading resources. Here is the primary source document for this one, the Diary of William Still, and some other sources that they can read and answer some of the questions for. So mini reading lesson is introduce the role cards from Freedom, as we just showed you. Compare the actions given to each role in the game as to what people historically did. So we just learned about them, and now we're going to learn how that matches up with the role cards. Identify the roles of those participating in the Underground Railroad, and many other ones. I'm just highlighting a few of them here. There's lots of writing assessments here, writing activities, and some either further extension activities. And of course, here's the reading material for that, the main one for that. And again, this can be printed off from the teacher. Lesson 3, the bold push for freedom, how the Underground Railroad worked. We learned some historical information here. Penalties for those caught. Slave catchers, we talk about how all that sort of happened. We look at some newspaper articles, some reward signs. What did those involved with the bold push for freedom face? Vocabulary, so we learn about lashes and shackles and bounties and other suggested reading materials. And then the primary source here is Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom by William Craft. And so through all this, we're going to have some reading and discussing what might happen to slaves during that were captured by slave catchers. How long might the trip take? Why did slaves move into Canada instead of just staying to the north? And then we choose a route to Canada for the board on the game, so to see some possible connections, so that we actually get the board out and we look at their routes and we talk about those. We introduce the mechanisms of play in pre-game scenarios. So this online, you go on the book's online site and there's a lot of scenarios printed in color that you print out. There are mini scenarios that you set up the slave catchers, you set up where the slaves are, and you're trying to show them mini scenarios of how the game works. So then we model this, we get the board out and we show them routes to Canada. We show them different things. There's also on the online site for the book mini scenarios that you could print out in color, and it introduces some mechanisms of play. These are called these pre-game scenarios. So they'll have some different scenarios where slaves are in certain spots, slave catchers in some spots, mini scenarios to show you, well, how would you get this guy past, and how can you disrupt the slave catchers on one way and then go the other way. So there's some mini scenarios you can play through there that are really cool. You assume the role of a slave boy or girl at your age. Write the story about your trip on the Underground Railroad. All sorts of extension activities there. And then, of course, in the back here, it has that main historical document that's going to be read by the students. Lesson 4, Slavery and the Law. The question of unethical laws, changing to laws over time. Talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and later, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. And then we get into the key concepts here and the primary reading document. It's an excerpt from the Constitution of the American Anti-Slavery Society. And then we get into the questions, like what actions were taken to work against the Fugitive Slave Act? What were the outcomes of the Kansas-Nebraska Act? So you learn about all these different acts and how, and you answer questions about how you feel about them. And depending on the time, the player, you may either revisit earlier scenarios that they had played, or with the advanced scenarios, because there's some easy ones, there's some hard ones, or you can move right into full gameplay as described in the next lesson, which is lesson 5, depending on how the students are feeling mechanically about the game. You write an article that appeared after your interview. So you are a reporter for the Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, and you're interviewing a shepherd, himself a former slave who escaped the North. So you're going to basically write an article after that interview as to what was said to you. And of course, we have the main piece of historical information there. And then we get to the last lesson where it's time to experience the game in its entirety. So they'll actually finally play the game. Up until this point, they're just learning little mechanics, learning the roles, learning some maybe mini scenarios. But here they actually start to play the full game in lesson 5. So it usually takes more than a single class to play. But they have this saver sheet that you can download, and it allows you to reset up and keep where you are each class. So you can maybe play one of the 3 eras each time. Now usually it's recommended 4 players per copy, but you could have 2 people doing each role and talking and things like that. Now the mini games, so the first goal of course is raising the strength and awareness of the abolition movement, and this is done by acquiring all the support tokens that look sort of like this in the game, because you have to get those to win. And the second is helping the slaves make their way towards Canada, and of course those are used using the conductor tokens in the game. Those are all talked about, they'll know about them by this time. And so we go through the different actual phases of the game in detail of how the game's played. And we were able to get a strong play experience just after the first era. So usually what happens is they set it up just one era for this first class here, and then you get through the first era before the end of the 3rd round. So the game has multiple rounds, and you're trying to have them get through just the first era, because it makes the game a lot smaller, a lot easier to digest for their first time. So basically you're just setting up the first era, and you cannot lose more than 1/3 of the total allowable slaves. So it's different rules, sort of a mini game, if you will, if you want, or if you have enough time, you can play the whole game if it's the beginning of that lesson. And then so you're setting that up. And players groups, so essentially after that, they discuss how their groups and roles impacted their approach and decisions during play. So you use all the history you've learned, and how did that change how you play, which is the real big thing here. And so it's really cool. So there's the appendix, there's all the information, there's information about, you have articles that writings for grades 6 to 8, where the main thing here is for high schools, and different sheets here. And then there's obviously more sheets that you can print out online through the book. But yeah, this is a great teaching material. 5 weeks, takes you through the mechanics of the game and then gets you to the game at the end. And that's how this manual is written. Well, I am a huge proponent in teaching with games. I love to teach certain things. When I'm playing games, I always look for teachable moments. I've even made some of my own courses that I've made on my own on PowerPoint on how to teach, like, let's say, probabilities using Formula D and things like that and teaching. So I'm a huge proponent of this, and I love what they're doing here. Now, this, I think, is the 5th book of the series. I also just reviewed the Teaching Revolution, the American Revolution, using 1775 Rebellion from Academy Games. And these books are similar in format, but they're actually quite different at how they attack it. I like that. I like how this publisher's not just putting everything in a box and doing the same format throughout. Yes, they're all 5 weeks. Yes, they're for high school students. But I like how, like in the 1775 Rebellion, 2 of the 5 weeks you're playing the game, and all the other weeks you're not, and you're just kind of learning a lot of stuff. This one is you don't actually even play the final game, the full game, or even a majority of a scenario until like the last session. So during the session, in the first session, you know, you're learning about the game and the components and the map and the colonies, and then you're learning about the roles and the role cards, and then you're learning about the conductor tokens, and you're learning aspects of the game as part of the learning, and you're building that foundation throughout the 5 different weeks. And then when you get to and then towards the 4th or 5th week, they have these scenarios that are printed out that are really cool. They go from easy to hard, and how do you know, they set up a certain scenario and they say, okay, get this slave to the north and distract the slave catchers over here and don't get anybody caught. And it's like these little mini scenarios that help you with the main mechanics of the game. So when you get to that point of week 5 when you're playing the game, because this game has a lot to it, that, hey, they're playing just one era. And, you know, you got to get through the first era and get the tokens and don't lose any over a third of your the slaves by the end of the first era. So it allows them to play like a shorter version of the game, like one third of it essentially. Or if they have time, they can play the whole thing. And I really like how they ramped that up in this. But equally as well, I like the other book where it dove you right in and then stepped back and gave you a bunch more historical information and then got you back into the game. And both of them worked for what they were doing. And I think it's brilliant that they are looking at each game and each book that they're doing this for differently, and they're attacking it the way it should. If you're a homeschool teacher, or if your kids are homeschooled and you're looking for a way to teach through games, teach history, this is a huge proponent, a great way to do it. If you're a school, I'm sure you can get in contact with the publishers and figure out how to work this in with your studies. And I like how they have the online resources that you can print out, all the extra stuff, in this case, all the different scenarios. Very well done book. This is amazing. I'd like to see this continue on for many more types of games and many more subjects. This is awesome. And once again, this is Teaching the Freedom Underground Railroad through play.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.